Pat and Susan rented a cabin in the woods for a weekend getaway. When they got to the cabin, they met the guy staying next to them, but had to cut the conversation short to bring their stuff inside quickly. A storm was coming, and it seemed like it was going to be a bad one. The sky was an eerie red glow. The wind was whipping. Tree branches were slamming the side of the cabin. After a short time, things calmed down, and the storm seemed to have passed. Then, in the middle of the night, there was a loud boom. It shook the whole cabin, knocking things off the shelves. Pat heard a voice call out in the darkness outside the cabin. It was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. "Susan, Pat, you in there?" The voice was familiar. It was Cody, the man staying in the cabin next door. Pat scrambled to his feet, pulling Susan up out of bed with him. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he stepped toward the door. "Yeah, we're inside, but..." He hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. "There's something out there." He pulled open the door. Cody stood just beyond the glow of the porch light, rigid as a statue in the clearing. The harsh beams of his headlights from his still-running vehicle cast jagged shadows over his form, obscuring his features. Something about him was off. His voice, when he spoke again, was hollow. "Come out. I'll keep you safe." Pat hesitated. Cody's voice was different, disjointed, almost as if it didn't belong to him. "You okay, Cody?" Pat called out. Cody's head tilted at an unnatural angle. His hood from his sweatshirt slipped down, revealing his face. His lips stretched wide, trembling as though something unseen was holding them apart. His eyes, full of something between pain and fear, flickered toward Pat, pleading. And then, bony long fingers slithered from behind his head, pressing against his cheeks. They forced their way into his mouth, stretching his lips even further, wider than a human mouth should ever go. And then they pulled. A horrible wet sound filled the air as his lips split like overripe fruit, blood pouring down his chin. Cody let out a strangled gurgle, but the thing behind him spoke instead. "I'm so happy to see you." The voice was thick, unnatural, and not from Cody at all. Pat's gaze flicked downward. Just behind Cody's shoes, half buried in the damp earth, was a face. A human face, motionless except for its black, empty eyes. Eyes that glowed with some unknown, unnatural light. The ground around it rippled, disturbed by something moving beneath. Cody's body convulsed, twitching as more pale, lifeless hands clawed their way from the soil, wrapping around his legs. "I was so thirsty," the buried face whispered, "but now I'm so very hungry." With one final jerk, Cody was yanked downward. His body vanished into the mud as if swallowed whole. The ground convulsed, bubbling as though it were alive. And then, stillness. But the face remained. It stared at Pat, watching him, tracking him without blinking. A breath hitched in his throat. The buried head glided forward, not moving, not crawling, but simply sliding through the mud toward him. Arms and fingers erupted from the ground around it like skeletal fins from a hunting shark. Pat slammed the door and locked it. His hands trembled as he turned to Susan, who had seen everything. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't know." Silence. Then, scratching from below. 100 fingers raked at the underside of the floorboards, digging, clawing. The wood groaned as the foundation trembled. The floor pulsated like a living thing, bulging upward and sinking down again as though something massive was shifting beneath them. Cracks splintered through the floorboards. Mud oozed up through the gaps, thick and dark, smelling of rot. Hands began pushing through, feeling for something, feeling for them. Pat felt paralyzed, trapped. They were going to be dragged down into that hellish earth, buried alive with those things. But Susan had other plans. She grabbed his wrist and pulled. "Run!" She sprinted toward the door, Pat barely keeping pace. The moment she yanked it open, they bolted toward Cody's vehicle, the headlights still cutting through the darkness. Miraculously, the engine was still running. They jumped in and Pat slammed the door shut as Susan threw it into gear. The tires spun against the damp earth before finally gripping, launching them forward. As they sped down the path, Pat dared one final glance back. The cabin was sinking, crumbling into the earth like a dying beast, being consumed by something far older and far hungrier than them. But just beyond it, in the middle of the trail, was that face, still half submerged in the mud, still staring, still waiting. They drove for what felt like hours before finally stumbling upon a group of police officers conducting a search mission for a missing person. Pat and Sue tried explaining, tried telling them everything, but the looks of the surroundings and unease on the officers' faces told them all they needed to know. "You were lost," one officer said, "disoriented, probably hallucinating." They were dismissed as distressed, unreliable witnesses. The official report listed the missing person, Cody, and the destroyed cabin as victims of a sudden mudslide. But every time it rains, Pat wonders, somewhere deep in the woods, does that thing still wait? A single face peering from the earth, black eyes unblinking. A million hands reaching just below the surface, waiting for the next person to pass by. Thank you for checking out Sinister Stories for You channel. If you love our spine-chilling tales and terrifying horror stories, don't forget to stab that subscribe button, murder that bell icon so you never miss a new horror-filled adventure. Your support helps keep the nightmares coming. Please comment below and let us know what kind of twisted, sinister stories you want next.